How to improve the overhead squat. Today we want to talk about how to improve the overhead squat. What are different ways to improve the overhead squat, and also what are common problems and shortcomings in the overhead squat that limits us from performing this exercise. How to improve the overhead squat? The simple answer, do overhead squats. Yeah, so I'm a little bit against the idea of if you want to improve something, you need to do something else. The first thing is we have that principle, SAID, specific adaptations to imposed demands. So if we want to get better at something, we have to do that. I don't say there's no way in doing other things, but the first thing should always be, if I want to get better at the overhead squat, I have to train the overhead squat, not a front squat or a back squat or leg presses whatsoever. If you want to improve the overhead squat, in my experience, the first thing I do is I look at the movement and the technical execution of that movement. From there, I can see what is the weakest part in that movement. Then we can look at, from the starting position, the descent, the bottom position, or the ascent, and then define where is the weakest link in the movement, and that's what we're going to attack. Common problems in the overhead squat. Let's go through it bit by bit. Having the bar overhead, the wrist has to be flexible and stable at the same time. That's what you see often when people start out and they have the wrist like this. They experience a little bit of wrist pain, and that's definitely something to work on. So mobility of the wrist, but also strengthening the wrist to be able to hold it overhead. Which brings us to the second point. The shoulders need to have a certain mobility to keep the bar overhead. That's also what we see, especially with a lot of athletes that are a bit tight in the shoulders. They are not able to keep the bar overhead. In the start position, yes, but once we go down, we always see the bar moving forward. So not the right amount of mobility in the shoulder is another problem. Same for the upper back, so thoracic spine mobility. You can see the same. So the spine is kind of rounding a little bit. The bar goes forward. So problem with the spine, not a problem, but the mobility is not enough to perform a proper overhead squat. And ankles. Ankles are also very important because you have to have the body more upright in an overhead squat than in a front squat or a back squat. And therefore you also need to be able to adjust your lower body, which means bringing the knees a little bit further forward than in a front squat or a back squat. And in order to do that, you need to have sufficient ankle mobility. If we're looking at all these points, I think you start to understand why the overhead squat is such a valuable tool in assessments, and that's why it's used for rehabilitation and assessments in rehabilitation as well, because it looks at the alignment of the whole body. It looks at shoulders, thoracic spine, hip, ankle. It gives a kind of complete picture. As a recap, in order to improve the overhead squat, work on the overhead squat. Look at the technical aspect of the overhead squat. What's the weakest part? Is it the start position? Is it the descent? Is it the bottom position or the ascent? From there, you can find the weakest spot and work on that. And then also look at the weak areas, the common weak areas: wrist, shoulder, thoracic spine, and ankle. And you'll be able to improve your overhead squat.